Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the virtual breakfast. My name is Phil Cates, and I'll be your host this morning. We're fortunate to have several of our specialists on board with us today, but we're going to start with Dr. Manni Singh, who is our cropping systems agronomist. And Manni has been working diligently to try and provide us with information on corn silage and dealing with immature corn silage. So Manni, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Phil. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody is doing good today. So let's jump right into our topics. We did switch gears a little bit, try to basically again answer some of the recent questions that people are asking. And I'm going to start with basically why we even feel the need to talk about immature corn, right? So it all started as all of you know that with that extended wet weather we had. Really delayed plantings because of that, right? By early June, as you can see in this graph, we had less than 40% of our area planted compared to a 5-year average of more than 80%. So that delayed planting basically caused some of the issues and concerns we have had at this point. In terms of growing degree day or heat accumulation, which is pretty much the driver for corn growth and development, as you can see in this figure, we have pretty much caught up, at least again for the whole growing season, and more so in the lower northern peninsula, as you can see here. The further north and the UP is still behind. But again, coming back to that delayed planting. So this is where we are in trouble, that basically the crops that were planted in June, they have not accumulated enough growing degree days to be further along in their development. And these numbers I'm showing here for East Lansing, anywhere from 11 to 14, 1500 is barely enough for the crop to get to silking and a little bit beyond that. So we have seen a lot of crops around that growth stage. And once the corn is silked, it takes about 11 to 1200 growing degree days to get to black layer, or about 900 if the target is a silage harvest around that half milk line. So once we have this information, we need to know what hybrids we planted, right? What was the growing degree day accumulation requirement for those hybrids? And in a year like this information is really important on top of the relative maturity numbers that we generally go with. And sometimes this information is easy to find, as you can see on one of this seed tag here, where it says right here the black layer is 2550. But in other cases, it might not be on the seed tag. You might need to go online, look for the hybrid, and can find that information, or talk with your seed company folks and get that information. Once we have that information, a tool like this is useful to usable that is available online, a public domain. It's very useful to understand basically where our crops are and what the future looks for. So I will show you a quick snapshot of how this tool works. But one point I wanted to emphasize here is that this tool does not account for a so-called compression in hybrid growing degree day with the delayed planting. So essentially what that means is that if we plant after a typical optimal planting time, let's say May 1, the hybrid will need less growing degree day to get to black layer. So based on some of this data coming from Bob Nielsen's program down in Indiana, they talked about 6.8 fewer growing degree days for every day delay after May 1st. So I expect this number to be similar in Michigan, but again, it gives us a ballpark number to begin with. So if we have a 30-day delay in planting, let's say May 31st, that'll give you about 200 growing degree day compression for that hybrid. And most of it comes after silking time. So again, I think about 76% of this number. So almost close to 5 growing degree days on a daily basis happens once the crop has silked. So going back to the tool, this is a snapshot of that tool. Again, pretty easy to find. Go online, Google U2U, and you should be able to see this. Once you are on that page, enter the the location you are in, and then the start date, which is pretty much the planting date. And then we can enter either the relative maturity of the hybrid, or I would recommend using that black layer as I have used here. And using that tool, it gives me my black layer to be around October 18th. So that puts me right at that average frost date for the East Lansing location I have used here. So basically, even for silage chopping, this would basically be a little bit too close to that first frost window. However, if I go in and basically account for that growing degree decompression by taking that extra 200 uh, units that I talked about, now this tool is telling me that my crop will get to black layer by end of September. So even for a silage chopping, it's going to be much sooner than that. So that gives me an idea where I am going to be in terms of not only grain harvest, but even for silage harvesting as well. So once we have that information, I wanted to talk about basically what are we looking in terms of if we feel that the crop is going to be too close to that first frost event. And I assume Jeff will talk a little bit more about that today, how we are trending. A typical frost basically for a corn plant to get injured, you're looking for that 32 degrees for few hours, or basically 28 for even fewer minutes. And a typical early season frost generally will damage, will injure the leaf canopy in the upper basically canopy of corn. But unless it's a really severe freeze, the plant will not die. So essentially those sugars that are accumulated in the stalk will move into the ear and into the kernels, and can cause or can result in basically increase in the dry weight of that kernel, as shown in some of these numbers I'm showing here, that a light frost compared to a killing frost will cause a less yield decline essentially. So basically you have from 7 to 20% increase in the dry matter with a light frost compared to a killing frost. So keep that point in mind. And since injury is dependent on the growth stage, the management will also depend on the growth stage. So scouting for the stage of the growth of corn when the injury happens is really important. As you can see in some of this data here, if that injury happens early in the reproductive phase, in milk or dough stage, the whole point moisture is going to be a little bit too high even for silage chopping. But if the injury happened at a later time close to dense stage, then basically the moisture might just be optimal to go ahead and harvest. So the frost typically can lead to basically, again, less energy in terms of less starch development and more fiber, again, based on what stage of development it occurred. So how does a frost injury looks like? So I have a quick picture over here, basically, again, mid to upper corn canopy. And you can see basically those typical water-soaked appearance of these leaves that are injured by the frost. But again, a point to keep in mind is that we are looking at these stalks and they still look green. So that tells me the plant is still not dead, and it will be able to move those sugars from the stalk to the kernels, and we'll see some starch accumulation, although there will be basically a decline in yield. So basically we recommend to wait for a few days before the field is scouted to see the impact of frost. So now moving on to basically, okay, if we have immature corn and if we have a frost injury, what we can do about that in terms of management, right? So basically harvest timing is the first one. And most of the research that has done by universities talks about basically allowing that crop to still dry down to the optimal whole plant moisture based on the silo structure that you are using. So that 65 to 70% window is still the way to go. Even though the crop might look a little bit drier because the leaves will turn brown, and you might think that it's going to dry quickly, but generally it will not. So again, that is a basically recommended, and there is going to be a trade-off between the loss of yield, dry matter yield, that will come by those leaves that are dying. They're going to fall down, so you might see 10-15% reduction in the dry matter yield, but then you will see improve in silage quality. So there is that trade-off that needs to be kept in mind. Again, we want to have an idea about basically that 900 or 45 days as a rule of thumb after basically silking before it gets to that optimal moisture. And using milk line just as a trigger is going to be helpful, but it might not be too useful if the crop is immature and injured by frost, right? So again, just use as a guideline, but do an actual estimation by various methods. A typical number is about 0.5% dry down per day, and that does not change much between frosted and non-frosted corn. So keep that perspective in mind. In terms of silage quality, again, basically, typically we see the peak quality in terms of the milk production, the milk per ton and the milk per acre at about that 50% milk line. Harvesting before that does cause basically a lower silage quality in terms of production because of the higher fiber content and low starch content, right? So typically 25 to 35% reduction if the harvesting is done before the ideal stage of maturity, ideal moisture content. If silage has to be harvested wet, we are looking at seepage losses that comes with the wet biomass in there, and it can also cause increase in shrink, so essentially a higher loss of dry matter because of the extended fermentation that might be happening in there. We can try to add dry matter in the form of grain store hay if basically we have to harvest at a high moisture. Some other quality concerns, basically one of the most important one is this clostridial fermentation that can happen if the silage is too wet, 70% or higher moisture content. This can lead to formation of butyric acid, which is unpleasant. It's unpalatable as well, so can suppress feed intake and result in botulism, which is pretty much animal death. So we need to keep that in mind. There is some talk about basically that if you have a frost event, it can lead to basically death of some of the naturally occurring fermenting bacteria on the crop canopy. So an addition of inoculant basically might be beneficial. So if you are doing that, I think that might be beneficial to target fields that have some immature and frosted corn. Nitrate levels is another concern here, especially basically if the upper plant canopy, those leaves die from frost. So basically the plant is accumulating those nitrates and doesn't have that photosynthetic machinery to basically utilize all those nitrates. Can be more dangerous if the crop was in drought conditions like we are in some of our locations right now, so can lead to that. But any factor that can lead to basically slow crop development can result in nitrate accumulation. So even cloudier days can lead to basically those accumulations, and mostly happens at the bottom of the stalk. So cutting height can potentially be increased, and again, waiting before the harvesting does help. So instead of harvesting right after a frost event, as I was talking before, might be helpful. In silage, this silage is going to be beneficial, can lead to 40 to 50% reduction in those levels, and it is always recommended to test that silage before feeding. And there are limits on the amount of nitrates that are listed down here. So I did talk about cutting height. So again, basically one management practice to account for that increase in nitrate levels, but there are pros and cons with that, right? A con is that it does result in lower total dry matter yield. 15-20% typically based on how high the cutting height was. But it does result in basically improved forage quality in terms of increase in milk per ton number, as you can see on this figure here. And it does lead to a reduction in the milk per acre number, but you can see even at 18 inches height, basically the reduction was within basically 5%, or the total number was 95% of maximum. So it does cost, again, I think there are pros and cons, but leaving some of this stubble back in the field does help with basically residue cover that could be helpful in the winter time as well. The last point I wanted to discuss here is basically this immature silage leading to some of the mold issues, both in the field as well as in the silos. Since we are recommending to basically not cut the crop right after frost event, it is going to stay in the field longer, right? So it will have that dry down period when the crop is injured. So probably you will have some of the sugars leaking out of the kernels, out of the stalk, and that pretty much inhibits the plant defense mechanism to avoid any fungal infection, so can lead to these mold developments, and eventually some of these mycotoxin accumulations can happen. So making sure that ensiling conditions are proper, basically anaerobic conditions, can help. Some silage additives or binders can help as well, but there is limited data about their actual benefit. And again, the point to emphasize here is that it is a field and not a silo problem typically. So we are better off managing this under field conditions if we can. And there are longer term management practices basically in terms of hybrid selection and fungicide applications, but again, not beneficial this late in the growing season. So there are a bunch of resources on this topic that are available. I have listed a bunch of websites here that you can log onto. We are also asking for help in tracking phenology in corn, so we can have a better idea about this growing degree decompression that I talked about. So we are better prepared in future. So we'll appreciate any help that you guys can provide. And we are also looking for some corn silage sample collection for a mycotoxin screening that we are doing as part of a project funded by the Michigan Milk Producer Association and the MAAA through MSU. So please contact me if you have a field that has a history of mycotoxins or you are seeing some of those molds. Please send us a sample, and then we'll do a full mycotoxin screen as well as a quality estimate for that sample for you. And with that, I'll wrap it up and see if there are any questions.
Manny, we did have one question come in regarding the use of Stover calcium lime treatment on sorghum Sudan grass or Sudan grass baleage. And it was from Clyde Taylor, and Clyde has used this in the past and the cows seem to eat it better. He's asking about digestibility. I don't have a lot of experience with this, so I'm asking this to those that are in the group today. Anyone have experience that they can share with Clyde on this question? Otherwise, Clyde, I will probably talk to Dr. Kim Cassida and ask her opinion on this a little bit later on and get back in touch with you. All right, no other questions. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Manny, for your reports today. Thank you for joining our virtual breakfast. Please go to the chat box and provide us with an evaluation, and we will see you next week. Thanks for attending. Have a great day.